Do you need a separate mouthpiece for both jazz and classical playing? Let's find out. So I've been a band director for 27 years, mostly teaching high school through that time. And the one thing that I always have to impress upon my saxophonists is the importance of having multiple mouthpieces. You need to have one for the concert band and you need to have one for the jazz band. You're not going to be able to be very successful if you just have one mouthpiece that you're trying to use for both. Now, a lot of people wonder, is it the saxophone that matters? Does a certain brand of saxophone sound better in the concert band or in the jazz band? And the answer is not really. What really matters is the mouthpiece that is on that saxophone and the reed you're using with that mouthpiece, and is it appropriate? Now, just for a little illustration, I have here two mouthpieces. I have a jazz mouthpiece that I typically play a lot. This is a Beechler Bellite. And I have a classical mouthpiece that I also play a lot. This is a Selmer S80C Double Star. There are other classical mouthpieces that you could also use that would be fantastic, like the Rousseau NC4, which is one that I have used a ton, especially playing with the Utah Wind Symphony. And then, of course, there are hundreds of options out there for jazz mouthpieces that you could use. The primary consideration, though, for someone playing in the high school concert band is that the mouthpiece produces a dark and singing quality to it. So I'm going to really quickly just switch the mouthpiece I have here. I'm going to take off my jazz mouthpiece. One thing I forgot about is that my jazz mouthpiece has a little bit narrower shank, and so it's compressed the cork down. So I'm going to use an old favorite trick. We're just going to wrap a little bit of paper around the cork just to take up that space, just to get us by, and then that should hold my mouthpiece where it needs to be. It's a famous solo from the Gordon Jacob original suite, and that's more of a characteristic kind of sound that we'd want to hear coming from the concert band. So now if I switch to my jazz mouthpiece, and this happens a lot, you got your saxophonist sitting in the concert band and they've got their jazz mouthpiece on, and you start playing the original suite. And I'm going to do the very best job that I can to get this mouthpiece into a dark classical style, and you'll see that I probably am not going to be super successful. And right away you can tell how bright that is, and I wouldn't say that it's really a bad sound, but it is not an appropriate sound for the concert band. It's going to stick out. We're going to draw attention to that area of the band. You know, maybe as a soloist that's one thing, but then when you go back into section playing, that player is going to really stand out. So again, that's the mouthpiece and reed that is creating that problem, and not the saxophone. So we can flip that around. So now why don't I play some jazz on my jazz mouthpiece? And you can hear immediately how much louder this mouthpiece is, and that is the main reason for having a different mouthpiece for the jazz band. And you don't want to use your concert band mouthpiece in the jazz band either, is because we need something that's going to get the saxophone section sound up to meet the brass level, so that the saxophones just aren't, eaten for lunch. So I'll switch back to my classical mouthpiece, and I'll try to do that that same jazz playing. So we can hear how that isn't really going to work very well in the jazz section at all. I'm not going to be able to compete. I don't have as nice a sound playing that style. Now, could I play jazz standards on this mouthpiece? Sure I could, if I want to be a little bit more mellow, if I want to be softer, if I don't need the extra power that I would get out of a jazz mouthpiece, I certainly could do that, but this would not work in the jazz section at all. This would have to be like playing in the corner of a coffee shop or something like that, probably exclusively, or maybe you just want to do your best Paul Desmond impression and you're doing solo stuff. Now, the last thing we have to discuss is the reeds, because different mouthpieces require different reeds, primarily because of the tip opening. And the one thing to keep in mind is that the more open the tip gets on a mouthpiece, the weaker the reed needs to be in order for that to have a resonant and easy blowing feel to it. Generally, classical mouthpieces are designed to have smaller tip openings and need a stiffer reed. So you'll usually see tip openings of around a 4 would be the normal tip opening, maybe as large as 5, and maybe sometimes as low as 3, but usually 4 is the sweet spot. And you'd normally pair that with a size 3 or 3.5 reed, and you'll have to do a little bit of experimenting to find out which reed works the best with that mouthpiece. Stiffer is not always better. Just keep that in mind. There's always been this myth around that, the stiffer the reed you can play on, the better player you're going to be on. That isn't the case. We want the stiffest reed that will still be resonant on the mouthpiece that you have chosen. And then on these jazz mouthpieces, the tip openings are much, much more open. This is a 7. And you'll see players typically playing 8, maybe even 9 tip openings, and that reed strength has to go down, and you'll probably be playing a 2.5 reed, maybe even as low as a 2, depending on how open that mouthpiece is. Now, it was very common back in the day for players in big bands to play on mouthpieces like Meyer, and they may have played on mouthpiece openings as low as a 5, and a 5, of course, is going to need a little bit stiffer reed. But a 5, honestly, with today's music and with the brass sections we're having to compete with, is just too small. I would say if you're not playing on alto saxophone, at least a 6 opening, maybe a 7, and on tenor, a 7-star opening or an 8. The more advanced player will play the higher number. But if you're not at least playing those openings, you're probably not going to be able to get enough volume to compete with those brass sections. So I hope this has illustrated pretty convincingly why players who are playing both in the concert band and in the jazz band have to have 2 different mouthpieces, one for each of those settings, and you need to pair the right reed for that to get the right sound.